Catholic History Trek, a podcast exploring the Catholic past.
Welcome to another episode of Catholic History Trek. I'm Scott Schulze, and in this episode, we'll be looking at the ever-exciting world of church furniture, or more specifically, church pews. If you were to walk into any Catholic church built 100 years ago, there are certain items you would expect to find, such as the high altar with its tabernacle, a communion rail separating the sanctuary from the congregation, confessionals, beautiful stained glass and statues adorning the interior, and rows of wooden pews where one would sit and kneel during the sacrifice of the Holy Mass. But if you were to walk into any one of the more modern Catholic churches built a century later, you might likely find that they've banished the high altar and placed it with a more simple table altar, had hidden the tabernacle in some far-off corner or closet, had tossed aside the communion rail, removed the confessionals, and purged any of the beautiful window or sculpted art. But perhaps the only remnant of a century ago which you may still find in a church of modern construction is the pew. And even if it's a more progressive parish that replaced the pews with chairs, you would still expect to find a spot to sit for the Mass. I mention this because a few years back I came across an antiquated term, pew rent. And I'll admit, I've paid for seats at theaters and sporting events, but never paid to sit at church. So I was curious as to the history of such an unexpected phrase, as I know many churchgoers tend to be creatures of habit and take up the same general spots every Sunday, but was there really a time when parishioners would pay rent to ensure that was a reality? I had to find out. And thus, the history of these wooden rows of church seats became the topic in this rent-free episode of Catholic History Trek. In the earliest days of Christianity, it was common for the first Christians to gather in homes with no favorable legal status allowing for the construction and worshiping in church buildings, as is available today to many Christians, outside, of course, of countries ruled by communists or Mohammedans, who both often ban the public worship of the one true God. Additionally, for these earliest Christians, in Rome, they are said to have met secretly in the underground Roman catacombs, celebrating the Mass on the tombs of the martyrs. And in the Holy Land, the Judaizing Christians met in the Jewish places of worship until they were kicked out for being too Christian, as it were. Usually where they met, they would utilize a table or such to serve as the altar of sacrifice and perhaps a cathedra or chair for the bishop or presbyter. But there was no formal seating for the rest of the faithful, who either stood the entire time or found rest on whatever was available, as we hear about with Eutychus, mentioned in Acts chapter 20, verse 9, who is sitting on the window during Paul's preaching, which went on so long that the young man fell from the third-floor window and died. Fortunately for Eutychus, Paul raised him from the dead, but he clearly could have benefited from the yet-to-be-introduced church pew. In the 4th century, thanks to Constantine, who subsequently became emperor after his victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, following the famous In Hoc Signo Vinces vision, Christianity transformed from illegal and persecuted to tolerated, accepted, and the religion of the empire. With the legal status of Christianity came the construction of church buildings for the swelling numbers of Christ's followers to gather. Many of these first churches took the form of the Roman Basilica, which was a rectangular-shaped building supported by rows of columns. At one end may be a narthex or vestibule, which served as an entry area leading into the long nave, which continued to the far end, where the sanctuary consisted of a semicircular round apse. Sometimes, on the sanctuary end, the building would take a slight cruciform shape, with small sections protruding out to either side. This basic shape has essentially been retained for millennia and is easily recognizable in many traditional Catholic churches. And I will point out, if you have a question on some of those terms I just mentioned previously, be on the lookout for an upcoming podcast from Kevin, who is going to be talking about church terminology. These churches, which often pointed east, lacked anything resembling seating for the congregation as we know it today, and those gathered for Mass were left to stand. Transitioning from the ancient churches to the medieval ones, The basic shape remained fairly unchanged, although sometimes the lectern or ambo would be moved closer to those attending the Mass, even to the middle of the assembly, so that the preacher could be heard better during the sermon. The seating or lack thereof remained unchanged too. Depending on the church, you might find perhaps a few benches for the elderly and the bishop's cathedra in a cathedral, and a choir of opposite-facing seats for monastics, or an intrepid layman who brought something to sit on, but the vast majority of those gathered for Mass were left to stand and kneel. But that was about to change. With the outbreak of the Protestant movement in the 16th century, many Protestant ministers rejected the sacramental nature of the Mass, turning the focus solely on their preaching of the Scriptures. With the radical change in the pastor's preaching, replacing Jesus' body, blood, soul, and divinity as the pinnacle of attention, the interior of the church changed as well. The role of those gathering on Sunday changed from active participant in the Mass to inactive spectator of a preacher's sermon. As such, seats were introduced for the congregants, who now spent the entirety of the service seated. With the printing press making printed materials more available, a seating position also made it easier for the congregation to read while attending their Sunday service. Unwanted altars and artwork were gradually removed, as were tabernacles, resulting in what can be seen in many Protestant worship spaces today, with the preacher and the instruments and the musical entertainers taking the primary focal point in the Sunday service, and padded seats providing the audience a spot to comfortably sit and be entertained by the preaching and musical performance. Eventually, Catholic churches began to adopt pews too, but at first only in Europe and the New World. It would be many years until the rest of the Catholic world found pews in their churches. When pews began to appear in Catholic churches, kneelers began to show up as well, which were unheard of previously. Kneeling had become the position of penance and submission in the medieval world, and it fit much better in a pew than full prostration could ever hope to do. And in the Eastern Orthodox churches, pews never found a home. Today, many of these churches are pewless, with only rare exceptions for those who absolutely need a seat. In the Christian West, pews started to show up in churches in an age when it wasn't uncommon for churchgoers to position themselves according to social rank. The nobility and those who were socially affluent would place themselves in the best spots and positions of honor, closest to the front, while the spectrum worked its way to the back of the church, with the last spots farthest away from the pulpit and even up in a loft or gallery, out of sight and out of mind, being used for the poor and in America for native Indians and slaves, and eventually freed slaves. Pews also made it easier for some denominations to accommodate for gender separation, which is still practiced in some places today. Adding seats for people to sit on were not only a benefit for the congregation, but also provided a means of income for a church building. In some locations, church-going families would pay for a pew, and those with more financial means would pay for a pew with better placement within the church, thus establishing their social position with a fixed pew. Those who could not afford to pay for a pew would take a spot in the free seats located in the rear of the church. This is essentially similar to paying top dollar for seats on the 50-yard line today versus settling for the faraway nosebleed seats at a football game, for example. But paying for a pew wasn't merely a way for those with money to assure themselves a good spot within the church, but the practice was often one of necessity for the church to raise funds for church construction. Those who paid for a pew would treat it like a small piece of real estate within the church building. As such, it wasn't uncommon for some of these pew owners to place a fence around their pew to prevent interlopers from trespassing. And thus, box pews arose in some churches, which were fenced-in pews with a gate that opened and shut, allowing the paying family access to the pew they'd paid for. And just with the previous sports analogy, it was often the practice that a family would pass on their pew for generations, just like a family passing on their season tickets for Green Bay Packers football games, for example. Some churches wouldn't sell permanent pews to parishioners, but rather would rent them. And this leads us to the idea of pew rent, which was the impetus for this episode. Pew rent worked much the same way as buying a pew, in that the rental fees were used to maintain the church's upkeep, but there were advantages for the church in renting instead of selling. It allowed for a steady stream of income, and it did not permanently tie a particular pew to a particular family indefinitely. As parishes grew and family dynamics shifted, multiple bought and reserved pews in a church could be sitting empty, or sparsely populated if the purchaser did not fill it up on a weekly basis. This could make the free seating overcrowded and potentially cause a new church to be built nearby to accommodate these changing seating dynamics. Again, returning to the sports analogy, it's akin to spotting many empty seats at an otherwise sold-out game where the season ticket holder didn't bother to show up at a particular game, but in owning the rights to the seat, they prevent others who may wish to attend the game from attending. Pew rent was not limited to Protestant church buildings, but was even practiced in some Catholic churches as a necessary means to raise funds. According to the Records of the American Catholic Historical Society of Philadelphia, the first rental of pews in that city dates back to 1827, with the rental fee being as high as $5 per quarter. Doing the math, that works out to be $464 per year today. These Philadelphia renters were also charged an extra 75 cents per quarter for church supplies, such as wine, candles, fuel, and the like. Apparently, the add-ons that many of today's season ticket holders pay, such as personal seat licenses, parking fees, and service fees, are not a modern invention. Father William Corby, who Kevin and I discussed in our previous episode of Catholic History Trek regarding Father Corby and Civil War chaplains, wrote an interesting line in his Memoirs of a Chaplain's Life regarding pew rent, describing how the Catholic chaplains of the Union Army spent the winter. Father Corby penned, "We spent our time in much the same way as parish priests do, except in this: we had no old women to bother us or pew rent to collect." It's said that the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore, held in 1884, encouraged pew rent as a method of drawing revenue for supporting the clergy and for church maintenance. The pastoral letter from the Third Council, written by Archbishop of Baltimore and Apostolic Delegate James Gibbons, mentions the need of using debt to construct churches for the burgeoning Catholic population fueled by immigration. And he stresses the importance of paying off the debts as soon as possible, pointing out the need of generosity so both pastors and laity can be saved from the painful necessity of frequent financial appeals. So, it's very likely that the practice of pew rent was favored by the Charm City's Third Council. From the mid-19th century up to the 20th century, churches shifted away from private pews to the open and rent-free pews we are familiar with today. Aside from a few historical examples, the box pews are gone, and pews have become more elaborate, with slots or clips added in the back of the pew to accommodate hymnals, missals, and prayer books. And in some churches, the hard wooden seats have been covered with soft cushions, and the churches that still have kneelers have often adopted cushioning that rivals something that came out of Mike Lindell's My Pillow factory. Although a number of Catholic churches have removed the kneelers from their pews, and some pews have been outright replaced with individual chairs, which is more common in Protestant gatherings. If you do attend a church of older construction, which still has its original pews, it's quite possible the pews may have a bracket or a number at the end, dating back to the days when it was rented. So, if you are a Catholic who likes to sit for parts of the Mass, you have the Protestants to thank for that. And if you like to sit in a seat that you don't have to pay rent for, you can thank your financially generous Catholic forebears for that. Kevin and I will typically end our podcast with the Glory Be prayer prayed in the Church's historic language of Latin, which would have been the language of prayer and Mass in the days when church pews were introduced. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sic ut erat in principio et nunc et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.
Thank you for listening to Catholic History Trek. You can reach us at catholichistorytrek@gmail.com.